Today we're going to be replacing both the diesel fuel injector as well as the glow plug on this 2002 Ford F250 Super Duty with a 7.3 liter Powerstroke in it. And we're going to start by disconnecting both the passenger side battery as well as the driver's side battery. That way we can keep from any surges of any type going through any of the pigtails we're going to be removing, as well as keeping ourselves safe from any type of shocks. So we'll do that, and then we'll come back and show you some of the other steps that need to be taken in order to get to that injector and get it replaced. Now that we have the batteries disconnected, we can start removing some other components that will make it a little bit more accessible for us to get to both pulling the valve cover off as well as getting to the injector. We'll start by removing the factory air box. Pretty simple actually. We've got a bolt up top here and a bolt in the back for the main part of the hose. We'll remove that first. Get the air box out of the way. It's not 100% necessary to remove the entire air box, but it will give you a lot more room to get in from this angle here. So we'll remove both of those, and that'll give us some access to get back here to the remainder of the piping. We'll remove that, and then we'll go to the downpipe from the turbo and remove that as well. And that'll just about open up the entire access area for us to get to that valve cover, pull it off, and then get to the injectors. And we'll show you that step next. Now that we have the air filter removed, the air filter cover, as well as the initial run of the breather hose assembly out of the way, it's time to go ahead and remove that downpipe from the turbo. And the easiest way to do that is, one, we do have two bolts coming down here, kind of past the alternator and below, that are going to reach into the beginning of the intercooler. They're going to be just like these here. We're going to remove those bolts at the bottom and remove them up here as well. And that's basically just a clamp holding that downpipe on with the sleeves. Just loosen those up on both the top and the bottom, and you can slide that downpipe out of the way. With our downpipe out of the way now, we can access the rest of our breather assembly hose and get some of those things out of the way. And you'll notice here, we've got some tubing, the green tube here, and then our red tube here for the wastegate that we're going to want to remove and get out of the way. Also, for the rest of this hose assembly, we have a bolt on the back side of this bracket here and one at the bottom that we're going to need to remove. And then right underneath of this hose assembly, there's going to be a rubber hose that's going to go into the breather portion of the valve cover. That's actually there with just a clamp and can be pulled right off. Once you get these bolts and the rest of these hoses out of the way and you pull that rest of that hose out, it'll come with it. Just give it a slight tug and it'll come along with the entire assembly. So we'll go ahead and remove the rest of this. And then once we get all of this removed, we can then go and remove the bolt here to our main power box, power junction or pigtail. We'll remove that. And again, this is why in the beginning of the video we disconnected those battery cables. We want to make sure, one, that we're safe, but we also don't cause any surges or power spikes or anything like that through this main harness. That would be a lot of work and a lot of damage that you'd have to deal with later on. So with those battery cables disconnected, we can safely remove this, and then we'll be able to get right to the injectors and the valve cover at that point. Now that we have our harness removed, you can see here, we also have the rest of the breather assembly removed. Everything's out of the way there. We can now access this valve cover and all the bolts that go around. And you'll notice that the plug for the harness here is still mounted to this bracket. That's going to be two of the top valve cover bolts. So once those are removed, this bracket can be moved out of the way, and then you can go around and get the rest of those valve cover bolts, pull the valve cover itself, and you'll have access to both the injector and the glow plug at that point. One thing to note here as well, the harness for the valve cover itself that's going to feed the power to both the injector for the pulse as well as power to the glow plug is plugged in here. Technically, you can leave it there until you get the valve cover off, or you can unplug it now. I prefer to go ahead and unplug it, get that out of the way. That way you don't cause any damage or any type if you're trying to pull this valve cover out and you have any kind of issue getting it around any of the other components that might be somewhat in the way. So we'll go ahead and disconnect the harness here, set it to the side, get this bracket removed, set it to the side, and then we can just pull that valve cover right off. Now that we have the valve cover removed and we can access the injector, we're going to start by removing the redirect and its bolt from the left side of the injector itself here. It's going to be a 5mm Allen socket. So we'll remove that first. And be sure to get the bolt as well as the redirect when you pull it out. And there you have those. And if you're doing more than one injector, make sure you keep those in a specific spot where you can find them later and you won't have them crisscross going from, say, injector 2 to 5 or 5 to 7, whatever the case is. You always want to try to keep all your parts together where they came from. So we'll set that to the side. Then we can get to the electrical connector, and it's just this tab here. We'll flip back on that, slide the electrical connector out, set it to the side, and now we have one bolt at the top, just under the connection here. We have one bolt at the bottom down here. What we'll do is we'll remove the bottom bolt and just slightly loosen the top bolt, and that'll allow the collar underneath the solenoid of the injector itself, there's a collar underneath here, to move back and forth freely. Once we have that collar able to move back and forth freely, we'll push up and then we'll be able to pull the injector out. Now before we pull the injector free, there's one last step we need to make, and that is a Ford recommended procedure, which is removing the 2 oil plugs that are sitting on the side of this injector here, in between 2 and 4, and then there's also one in between 6 and 8. We'll remove those plugs with an 1/8 inch Allen socket. We'll just set those to the side until we get ready to put everything back together. And now that we have the injector broken free, we'll push that collar up and we'll slip that injector right out of its hole. Now that we have our injector out, we want to do one more thing before we go any further in the process, and that is inspect the injector and make absolutely sure that this copper ring, gasket O-ring, comes with the injector when you pull it out. What happens sometimes, this copper ring will stay down in the bottom, and when you go to put the new injector in, it'll basically essentially just double gasket it, which will do a couple things. It's going to make it to where the injector doesn't seat properly, and you're going to have a lot of problems if that happens. So make absolutely sure that this copper ring comes with the injector when you pull it out. Our next step in the process is going to be removing the old glow plug now. And if you look here, where this white wire leads down to this little plug, that's our glow plug-in connection. So we'll pull that, we'll put it out of the way, and then we've got a 10mm deep well socket we're going to need to use to remove the glow plug. We'll pull that out and we'll get to the next step. With our new glow plug installed, tightened down, and reconnected, it's now time to put our injector back in. And of course we'll start and we'll remove our little rubber gasket at the end. And then what we're going to need to do is take just a little bit of engine oil. We've got a little bit here around the edges. We're just going to coat those O-rings a little bit. We don't want them getting squished or bound or anything like that once we put the new injector in. Doesn't take a whole lot, just a little bit. And what we'll do, again, make sure your new ring is here, your copper O-ring. And what we'll do is, when we go to install it, we'll push forward on this collar and we'll set the top of the injector down first on the top bolt. Remember, we didn't remove that top bolt. It's still sitting here. And that's what we're going to set the collar down on first so that we can then go from the back side and do the bottom bolt. And then what we're going to have to do here, we are going to have to give this some light taps to get that in. And the best way to do that, honestly, just use your hand. A lot of folks will use a hammer, rubber mallet, things like that. What you don't want to do is put a lot of force on the solenoid. Easiest way to put an injector in and have it not work immediately after is to damage this solenoid. So we're not going to be smashing on this with any hammers of any kind. We're just going to put as little bit of force on it as possible to get it down, enough to get to that bottom bolt, and that bottom bolt will torque it down all the way the rest of the way. Now that we have our injector replaced, we have our redirect replaced, we have everything torqued down to the right specifications. We've got our pigtail replaced here and reconnected. We need to make sure we go back through and put our oil plugs back in, the one closer to the front of the motor and the one in the rear of the motor. And keep in mind too, when we removed the old injector, we introduced fuel and oil into that injector housing. So what we need to do before we start the vehicle up, because we don't want the vehicle to hydrolock, we're going to take a socket and a breaker bar, and we're going to mount it to the harmonic balancer, and we're going to slowly turn the motor about 10 to 15 revolutions and make sure that that fluid drains down. Because again, what we don't want to do is start the truck up immediately and then have a hydrolock from that fluid being inside. So we'll get everything bolted back on. We'll get the harmonic balancer turned several times, make sure that fluid turns down. We'll get our valve cover back on. We'll get all our pigtails reinstalled. And then, of course, we'll get all our piping back in place. We'll get our duct back in place for our air filter. And just make sure everything's tightened down and secured, again, to the right torque specifications, and everything's back to where it needs to be. When we do go to start the truck for the first time, however, we're just going to turn it over a few times. We're going to let it build oil pressure. Remember, these injectors work off of oil pressure, so we need to build that oil pressure up first, then we'll give it a good start. You will probably notice some white smoke coming out in the beginning when you first start it up. It's very normal. It'll go through pretty quick, and then you'll be back up and running in no time. Just keep in mind, once everything is done, you get the truck running again, and you know that it's idling properly and it's driving properly. Make sure you go in and check any codes, clear any codes that were associated with the injector in the first place. And if you have the scan tool, go through and just make sure all of your injectors are pulsing properly and functioning properly. And hopefully now you have a better understanding of what it takes to remove and install both an injector and glow plug on a 2002 F250 with a 7.3 liter diesel in it.